conscious beings and the nature of their relationships with both material nature and the Supreme Person. That was an interesting discussion. And then today we have our dear Akhandadhi Das. He's presenting on chapter 7 on inspiration. Akhandadhi served as the principal of Bhaktivedanta Manor Theological College from 1982 to 1995, and he served on Central Religious Advisory Board for the BBC since 1989. Is that still current, Akhandadhi?
The actual board, the Central Religious Advisory Committee, doesn't exist anymore, but there are other incarnations of it, and I'm still very much involved with the BBC as a contributor to their flagship programs.
Yeah, thank you. Okay, and he's also one of the board of directors of the Bhaktivedanta Institute for Higher Studies. He works closely with the TOVP cosmology team. He's also the person behind the Atma Paradigm channel and its content, and I know he works on different projects that explore the intersection of science and consciousness. I was thinking that this introduction doesn't do you justice, but we'll leave it there for now. So thank you very much for presenting on this chapter. This is a really interesting one, probably my favorite in this book. So go ahead. Welcome to everyone that's just joining, and you can go ahead and begin.
Well, thank you very much, Leela. This has been a fantastic privilege and honor, and a delight to be invited to speak on this. So thank you to Krishna and Krishna Kripa as well for extending this invitation. Yes, I remember reading this way back when the monograph was first produced on inspiration, and it's such a pivotal chapter within mechanistic and non-mechanistic science within this book, and I'll explain the purposes that Sadhuputta hopes to reveal just by focusing on this particular aspect. But let me share a screen. It needs me to go back. I've got a very small screen to work with there. I think that's about right. Has that title page come out okay for everyone?
Yes, it looks good.
All right, thank you very much. Okay, this is the Richard L. Thompson lecture series on mechanistic and non-mechanistic science, and we're looking at chapter 7 entitled On Inspiration. Excuse me if I refer to Richard Thompson by the name that I knew him by, Sadhuputta Das, and that's because that'll come out more naturally for me as we progress through this. So this chapter starts with a question. How do humans acquire knowledge in art, music, and science? And really this is a little bit of a hook, because we'll see how Sadhuputta is going to use this phenomenon of this aspect of conscious experience, inspiration, to really open up some major discussions on the biggest philosophical questions of all. But let's just start with reminding ourselves of one incident of inspiration. This is a musical interlude.
It's not coming out well. You need to click when you go share screen. There's a little box on the bottom that says something about sound. You need to click that and it sends a sound through it.
Ah, I apologize. Did that not come out at all then?
A little bit, but
All
there's
right.
you got to unshare and reshare the screen and then hit the there's a button that says sound.
I think it'll be better if you just sing the song yourself.
Okay.
This is the melody of Yesterday. And the story goes that Paul McCartney, when he was staying at his girlfriend's parents' place, woke up one morning and realized he had dreamt a melody. He heard this melody, etc. And he wondered, where did that come from? Do I know that song? Was it something I've heard? Because the Beatles did a lot of listening to all sorts of influences and trying to bring that into their own songwriting. So he kind of assumed that it must have heard it from someone. So the story goes that he was contacting everyone he knew. He had transposed the song, learned the melody. There was no words to it at that point, but he was calling people saying, have you heard this song? Where's this from? And no one could tell him that it existed. So eventually he came to the conclusion that, yeah, he'd heard this in his dream. It had been composed while dreaming. So this is just one example, and we're going to hear much more rigorously analyzed examples in this chapter. But it's just to give us a flavor of where we're going on this. The purposes of this chapter that I see that Sariputta is trying to achieve. First of all, the whole phenomenon of inspiration really exemplifies the problem that the mechanistic view of mind has in trying to explain what's going on. Of course, there's the problems of qualia and other aspects of subjectivity, but inspiration is a very particular problem that is, we'll see, practically impossible to explain from a mechanistic view that the brain produces consciousness and all mental states. But it does more than that. It highlights the role of universal consciousness. Sariputta has already mentioned this in brief, but now in this chapter, he's going to really show the role that the Paramatma, the super self, the super soul will play or does play in the interactions of everyday life. And this helps to build the model that Sariputta is doing throughout the book, that there is a call for an extended science, extending science, so that it actually covers all the laws of nature. But this means that we have to have a broader view of what we mean by nature and what we mean by the laws of nature. And what this chapter ultimately does is give a philosophical underpinning for the scientific process of bhakti yoga. So, acquiring scientific knowledge. Sariputta starts off with saying, normally it uses a hypothetico-deductive method. You formulate an hypothesis and then test it through experiment. But the question really comes, where do these hypotheses come from? How are they being generated in the mind? And Sariputta quotes Einstein in this regard, saying, on principle, it is quite wrong to try grounding a theory on observable magnitudes alone. In reality, the opposite happens. It is the theory which then determines what we can observe. So there's an indication in that statement that somehow or other, the theory, the idea of how something works comes first, comes out of almost nowhere, suddenly. And then the justification for how it does work or how it can be verified comes later. In mathematics, which of course is Sariputta's field, he explains that mathematics has a slightly different version of this hypothetical deduction system. It proposes it uses systems of mathematical reasoning, which are intended to answer specific questions. And generally, that's a step-by-step process of verifying that proof is correct. And that seems a very logical, rational way of going about it. But what we find is that that is not always the case for how it does happen with great advances in mathematics by some of the major personalities in the field. So the system itself has no systematic method for generating mathematical proofs or ideas. They've got to come from somewhere first so that there is a solution that can be worked out step by step. Sadhaputta then gives us a very common story, the eureka moment of Mr. Archimedes. And the story here is that in Syracuse, the King Heron, had given a quantity of gold to a goldsmith and asked him, use all of this to make me a beautiful crown. So sometime later, the goldsmith comes back and here's the gold crown. But the king is suspicious. He doesn't trust this goldsmith. He's thinking, this guy probably took some of the gold and mixed in silver and created the crown, but it's not all of my gold. So he turned to his friend Archimedes and said, I want you to solve this problem. How can you prove to me that this crown is actually 100% gold? Now, the rule is you're not allowed to damage it. You can't drill into it. You can't scrape it or anything like that. You can't damage it. It's beautiful. But can you prove to me that it is 100% made of gold? Archimedes is thinking about this. He already understood about relative density. He understood that gold really, a volume of gold weighs twice as much as the same volume of silver. So he was thinking, well, maybe that's a way of solving this. But the question was, how do you measure the volume of an irregular object like a crown? If it was a cube or a sphere, you could easily do some calculations. But a crown, how do you work out the volume of that accurately? So he was thinking, but no result. So at one point, he was relaxing. He went off to the public baths, jumped in the baths. The water splurted over the edges, and he goes, Eureka! That's what it's all about. The displacement of the object will tell me in the volume of water what the volume of the crown is, and that way we can work out the densities. And the rest, as you say, is history. So that's a eureka moment, a sudden, unexpected awareness of a solution, of a way of dealing with the problem. It's often after prolonged and fruitless endeavor to solve it. So the person has been working, he's been trying to do the step-by-step, he's trying to use his logic, all his resources, everything he can think of, researching and so on. But still the problem remains unsolved. And this solution seems to come often, and there's no hard and fast rules on this, but it's often when that individual is not consciously thinking about the problem. It just comes to him, as it did to Archimedes in his bath night. So it generally offers a whole new way of looking at the question. Rather than thinking we'll measure the little bits and we'll add it all up, for the volume of the crown. No, we can do it all in one shot, just by a completely different methodology. And the interesting thing for these individuals, and we'll be citing quite a few of the ones that Sadhaputta mentions, is that when they get the solution, there is a kind of strange realization that this is it. This is complete, this is final, this is a correct idea. So how does all this happen? Well, let's look at some of the examples that Sadhaputta uses. This is Carl Gauss. He very famous for his discoveries in number theory. Of course, his name is given to Gaussian distribution. He did stuff on differential geometry and all sorts of things. So these guys really work across the board, dealing with major mathematical issues and bringing in new discoveries all the time. So there was a situation where he was working on a theory of whole numbers, and Sariputta takes a quote from him. He says, "Like a sudden flash of lightning, the riddle happened to be solved. I myself cannot say what was the conducting thread which connected what I previously knew with what made my success possible." It was just this sudden realizations. Another example that Sariputta uses is Henri Poincaré, who did stuff on electromagnetic laws with Maxwell, also the three-body problem, which is very important in cosmology. And he wrote a book called Science and Hypothesis. Sariputta didn't indicate if he read this, but it seems to draw a lot of things from this particular book. How Poincaré understood that scientific knowledge is never certain, and he gave the epistemological rationale for that. And for himself, he emphasized creative and intuitive aspects of scientific thinking. So not simply attacking something just routinely, step by step, is going to produce the answer. You have to be open to other ways of receiving information, knowledge, and understanding the solution to a problem. So there's a quote Sariputta gives from Poincaré while he was working on a theory of numbers. And he said, and this again, he was away on a little trip. He had stepped away from his work. And he says, "At the moment when I put my foot on the step, the idea came to me, without anything in my former thoughts seeming to have paved the way for it." And this was something that was to do with non-Euclidean geometry. And then later, he links it with another aspect of his work and says that he suddenly realized that with just the same characteristics of brevity, suddenness, and immediate certainty. Again, from the world of music, there's an extensive quote that Sariputta gives from Mozart about his compositions, which are, he is one of the great composers because there's something rather magical, inspirational about his music. It's fresh and new and vibrant. And where does it all come from? Mozart says, "Well, once I have a theme, another melody comes, linking itself with the first one in accordance with the needs of the composition as a whole. Then my soul is on fire with inspiration. The work grows. I keep expanding it, conceiving it more and more clearly until I have the entire composition finished in my head, though it be long." And he says, "It doesn't come to me successively with its various parts worked out in detail, as they will be later on, but it's in entirety that my imagination lets me hear it." So this gives us some of the features of inspiration, that there seems to be a source for this new insight, this solution or whatever to a particular problem. And that source seems to lie beyond the subject's conscious perception, because as these various statements indicate, there is nothing in their mind that says, "I was working on this and then I got it." No, that they're not consciously aware of whatever steps it took to get to the solution. And it provides information that probably was unobtainable even if they had tried to consciously work through it. So Poincaré actually spent some time meditating on this aspect and thinking, well, what does this mean? He was definitely moved by the fact that he was having these inspirational thoughts, and that there has to be some mechanism something behind them, because they're revealing something about the nature of the human mind, the nature of consciousness. So he coined the idea that there seems to be a subliminal self, something which is developing these ideas, and then only when it's complete, presenting it to the conscious self. So Poincaré said, this subliminal self is in no way inferior to the conscious self. It is not purely automatic. It is capable of discernment. It has tact, delicacy. It knows how to choose, to divine. What do I say? It knows better how to divine than the conscious self, since when he's talking about divine, he means coming to a clear conclusion. He knows it knows better how to divine than the conscious self, since it succeeds where that, i.e. the conscious process, has failed. In a word, is not the subliminal self superior to the conscious self? Then he thinks, oh my God, what am I saying? And he says, if that's true, then I would hate to accept it. Now, the interesting thing is that what Poincaré is indicating are aspects of the Vedic picture. The unconscious subliminal self can be modeled with the idea of mana, the mind, because mana is capable of all of these aspects of churning ideas, data, just choosing, coming up with ideas, coming up with processes. Mana is capable of doing that. It's doing that all the time for us and making us aware of what we take to be our thoughts, our desires, and so on. So, but mana is not conscious. It is not animate. It is a material element. It is basically the artificial intelligence aspect of that is attached to us as the Atma. And it is just one of the material elements, but it is capable of this sort of ability within in serving us, coming up with ideas. But it couldn't do that without the ability of a higher agent. And that's also possible. And that's also what's been indicated here, that there must be some greater agency feeding the mind, because where is it getting its ideas from? How is it bringing all this together? What's controlling, what's facilitating the mind's ability to generate these ideas? So in that case, there is something greater than the conscious self, but it is not the subliminal mind. We're going to hear about it as the superconsciousness. So Poincaré was very disturbed by his thoughts in this regard, and he kind of backtracks and said, no, there must be a mechanistic explanation. You know, somehow or other, the mind is doing this, and if the mind's doing it, the brain's doing it. And that's the big misconception that exists within the modern philosophy of mind and how it permeates and influences neuroscience and physics and everything, and all the way we look at consciousness and the abilities of the mind. We just assume that somehow or other the brain does it. That's the point. The mind is capable of all sorts of amazing things, taking neural data and turning it into qualia, giving it a richness that the brain has not got. And we just say, oh, well, somehow or other the brain does this. It represents its data to us. So this is a very incomplete and questionable approach by the mechanistic, those with a mechanistic view. that they're ascribing things which are actually beyond the ability of the brain. And we're just saying somehow or other, these are products of neural activity. So in this case, with inspiration, though, we've got a chance to really look at, is there a mechanistic explanation for inspiration? Can you really say the brain could do this? So the mechanistic explanation really takes the idea that the mind is some kind of mental machine. It's basically what the brain does, you know? So there's no explanation for an individual's subjective experience of conscious self-awareness. That's a very nice specific quote from Sariputta, how he puts the hard problem. No explanation for an individual's subjective experience of conscious self-awareness. So this Sariputta's definition of what later became the hard problem actually precedes Chalmers' statement on it. And so this is a very nice one to pick up on. An individual's subjective experience of conscious self-awareness. And it is the whole basis for the Atma paradigm. So how might the machine of the brain generate the solutions we witness in the cases of inspiration? If you're saying the brain does it all, well, let's have a little look if that's possible. So Poincaré makes a stab at it. He says, well, maybe the subliminal self generates many combinations of mathematical symbols. Now, of course, because this is a random process that the brain is using a lot of the time, most are going to be useless. Even if the brain is able to figure out the utility of some of those combinations, how can it really understand the utility of them until it gets to the end? If it's only when you reach the end that you understand that the steps you've taken work towards that. But maybe there are some things that seem to be to the brain to be more useful than others. But most will be useless, most will be illogical. And the interesting thing is, we are only told the answer when it's all finished. Now, Sariputta then analyzes this, and he considers, well, how many combinations could the brain actually put together? And he tries to be really generous. And he says, if you consider just an angstrom unit, which is the tiniest thing that space that exists in physics, and you say in each cubic angstrom unit, there could be a combination formed. And that is being formed, at the rate of 1 billion a second. So generous figures here. Then to look at all the possible combinations within the brain within a reasonable working life of a human, you get 3.2 times 10 to the 46. That's a huge, huge number. 10 to the 46 of anything. And then Sariputta explains, yes, seems a big, huge number, but it's infinitesimal compared to the possible combinations of mathematical symbols, which there are many, and there are many, many steps to any mathematical proof. And he did an analysis. Well, say you've got this kind of decision tree being shown here, where from one thing you can go to 1, 2, or 3 different routes, and you build up the tree. And basically, but within 33 symbols of length, you work out that you have a possible combinations in that tree of 10 to the 100. And that's, those who understand powers of mathematics will understand 10 to the 100 isn't twice 10 to the 46. It's 10 to the 54 times that, which is just out of the ballpark in terms of mathematical viability. So Sariputta has demonstrated that the brain, just left to its own random processes, cannot deal with this. So then he goes back to give some other examples and says the problem is actually even more difficult than this. And he gives the example of Bernard Riemann and working on a zeta function. And before he died, he left a note describing the properties of the zeta function regarding prime numbers, but he didn't give any proofs of them. Now, we all know in our school days, whenever we did maths, we were always told, show your workings. You know, you can't just write down the answer. You know, you have to show your workings. And that demonstrates you didn't just copy it from the guy next to you, but you actually know how you got there. But here is someone, a famous mathematician, just writing the properties of a zeta function regarding prime numbers, and he's giving no proof to it. And in fact, it was only other mathematicians working after his death and using concepts and principles that were unknown during Riemann's life, only using other developments in mathematics that came much later, finally starting to prove each of these different properties of the zeta function. I think all but one of them is now being proved. So that raises really important questions. If these facts were unknown during his life, because he makes no reference to them, he shows nothing about them. And so others have said, even if he did know those facts, it's hard to know how he could have come up with this theorem by step-to-step analysis of them. So this gives us an understanding that these guys are tapping into sources of information that are not only beyond their conscious self, but beyond the subliminal self. Another example is Évariste Galois, a French mathematician, died very young. And he sent a theorem, just in real rough terms, without any proof again, to his friend just before he died. And again, it was only comprehensible what this theory was all about years after his death, once other mathematicians had new mathematical concepts, principles, systems in place. They could understand, now we can see how this theorem fits in and how it is valid. But to Galois, it was valid, correct, and true from the time when he received it through inspiration. So what are we getting from these different examples? That there is a process in maths, and this applies to other forms of gaining knowledge in other fields, but in maths, there's a process of choice underlying inspiration. Something is happening within how you get to that solution and say this solution is the correct one. And with maths, this is elaborate and sophisticated, and we can practically understand the number of steps that it takes to get there when these proofs are done later. And the interest, and many, as we've said, many of these principles are unknown to the subject who has the inspiration. So therefore, it seems from the mathematical analysis of what the brain is capable of doing, that no trial and error system within the brain is unlikely to exploit such principles. And again, the interesting thing is that, well, you might say, well, yeah, but maybe we only know the complicated ways to solve that theorem. Maybe there's a very simple way that Galois, Riemann, and all the others had for reaching their theorem. Maybe it's actually really simple. Well, if so, no one ever since these guys have ever found that simpler solution. So there is use of subtle selection criteria, and it seems to involve emotional sensitivity and appreciation of aesthetic qualities. And we're not just talking about when this applies to art and music. even in maths, there seems to be you recognize that there is a harmony, the connections are there. Somehow or other, they're experienced like this. As Poincaré says, they are felt rather than formulated. Something is different about these conclusions from inspiration that distinguishes them from ordinary things we may work out through a routine process. Not trial and error. Rather, there seems to be a direct choice being made and a recognition of the value of the solution that has been obtained. So, if we were to accept the mechanistic explanation that the brain is able to do it, and we've already seen that it hardly seems that even with the number of connections in the brain, this would be possible, still maybe there would need to be some kind of algorithm within the brain that is existing in order to guide the use of its neurons in a particular way to reach a solution. So we can solve all sorts of wonderful things with computers these days. And the computing power of computers and artificial intelligence has advanced incredibly in the 40 years since Sariputta wrote on inspiration. But still these questions would be there because we're talking about the brain. So how does an algorithm arise in the brain that would put together all those different symbols in the right order, in the right steps, in order to reach a solution that the conscious person, and you'd have to say, and then the brain was not aware of beforehand? Where does that algorithm come from? How does it exist? Is it from genetic information being passed down through the through the mathematicians' ancestors? But that seems rather ridiculous, because in the evolutionary theory, it's hard to say what the survival benefit of such an algorithm, which would have to be very specific. Algorithms are not randomized instructions. Yes, even when they're using deep learning and feedback processes, these are very carefully coded, and the way that they are able to learn, of course, has to be guided by generally human input or very particular criteria. So what are all these criteria that the brain has encoded in genetic form so that the brain would actually generate a mathematical theorem? Is it just a few extra mutations from the simple algorithm that his ancestor or parents used to think up this, that, and the other that suddenly becomes more capable of generating very powerful mathematical theorem? No, that doesn't seem logical. Even if we use the neuroscience mantra that neurons that wire together, neurons that fire together wire together, then you have to assume that the brain has worked out all these steps, knows all the new discoveries, and can set that up in itself. That doesn't seem likely either. So Sariputta rejects the idea that an algorithm could have origins, in the biological situation of the body and brain. And it also goes against the whole issue of subjective experience, because most people seem to get the result directly, and that's the situations within inspiration. Simple routine things can be done through laborious step-by-step processes. But if inspiration is caused by an algorithm, which is subliminal, then why is it experienced as abrupt realization? Why isn't the conscious person experiencing the thought processes that are leading up to it? At least some of them. So Sariputta really now wants to bring this together and show that there's got to be another way of looking at it. And that tends to be the process within mechanistic and non-mechanistic science. There are major problems from just thinking of nature, of our experience within it as purely mechanistic. It just fails to explain stuff. And he summarizes what he has done so far. He says, in the first part of the book, we talked about consciousness, and we came to the conclusion that the conscious self must be a non-physical entity. In the old parlance of BI, we used to say it is a non-chemical, non-physical ordering particle. That is the definition of the Atma or soul. So the term that Sariputta likes, we're not using Sanskrit, is the conscious self, different from other aspects of selfhood, which may be psychological, personality-wise, social, and so on. We're talking about the conscious self, the experiencer, is a non-physical entity. And then he says in the second part of the book, we've gone through, can a mechanistic view of life explain complex forms? No, they can't. But you can explain complexity in biology if you bring in what he says is the non-quantifiable idea of universal consciousness. So this is indicating that there is a higher intelligence, a higher source of knowledge, which has the ability to manipulate matter in order to produce complexity, whereas mechanistic, random, stochastic processes cannot do that. So now he's saying, well, it almost seems a change of tack, but he says, this really kind of brings us to the question, which goes back to the challenge of Princess Elizabeth to Descartes, that how does the conscious self influence the behavior of the body? If we're saying the conscious self is a non-physical entity, then how does it interact with the physical biological body? So this becomes the question that he now wants to explore. And he makes the point that we want to try and generate a unified picture of nature. And I'd like to speak a little bit on that a little bit later. But this is the project of mechanistic and non-mechanistic science, to show that there can be a unified picture of nature which brings together consciousness, complexity, biology, matter, brings it all together and more. And he starts it by making the statement that the interplay of the Jivatma, this non-physical conscious self, this entity of consciousness, the Jivatma, and its body is indirect. So we have an indirect relationship with the body. We are not directly controlling it. That the activities of the body are being facilitated by the interaction of the localized self, Jivatma, and universal consciousness, Paramatma. So the interaction is not with the Jivatma and the body. The interaction is between the Jivatma and universal consciousness, Paramatma. So this is postulating a kind of philosophical imperative that in order to really understand how this could work, you need both the individual conscious self and the supreme universal conscious self, the Paramatma. And this is now giving Sariputta much greater scope for bringing in the role of Paramatma, thanks to the experience of inspiration. So he says, once you've got that picture that the Jivatma and the body don't relate directly, but it is indirect, and that actually the facilitation is between Jiva and Paramatma, and then you've got something which will address the mind-body paradox. And it also accounts for inspiration, because it entails a direct method by which the individual self can gain knowledge, and possible, and he's going to extend it, knowledge of mathematical theorems, for instance, knowledge of new musical melodies, whatever. But more particularly, it is also a source, a possible source of information regarding both ourselves as conscious entities and our relationship and knowledge of the Paramatma himself. So, Sariputta is trying to build this on the philosophy of the Gita. So, in the balance of this chapter, he is bringing in many of the statements of the Gita, particularly this aspect of, are we the doer? And he quotes Bhagavad Gita, chapter 3:27. The spirit soul, bewildered by the influence of false ego, thinks himself the doer of activities that are in actuality carried out by the three modes of nature. And then 5:14, the embodied spirit, master of the city of his body, does not create activities, nor does he induce people to act, nor does he create the fruits of action. All this is enacted by the modes of material nature. Now, these are strange statements for people who are convinced they are this body, because we really believe that it is me as this body, as the brain within it or whatever, that is making decisions and deciding how I move my hands and how I do all different things, how I speak, I am creating activities, surely. But what is being explained in the Gita is that all our desires, all our willfulness is being read and translated by the super soul into activities happening within the material world, and it is translated actually into information that is related to the three modes. And because of the three modes and the way that they operate, manifest properties, the world is changing around us and things are happening, and that's a whole subject in itself. But the concept is that we have a set of laws of nature. It's not working capriciously. Something is happening that is where the Paramatma is taking our desires, facilitating them he's facilitating them within the activities of his own nature, Prakriti. Prakriti belongs to superconsciousness. We are explorers within it. And often within the BI recently, we've been using the examples of virtual reality, which give an understanding of how I, as a conscious being, can seem to enter a world which really isn't under my control, but my wishes are being taken by the virtual reality coding and thanks to the will of the programmer, manifesting in the activities that I see my little avatar carrying out in front of me. So I am now identifying myself as that avatar because it's moving according to my will. Similarly, we believe we are this body, creating activities in the world because of identifying with a body which has actually been operated by the modes, but because those modes are being controlled by Paramatma, and because Paramatma is reading our desires and moving the body in accordance with that, we think, I am doing this. And at times, Prabhupada in his books often talks about as if we are the controllers and we are the doers. But actually, the mechanism is Jiva to Paramatma to modes to the manipulation of material energy. So Sariputta wants to bring in the laws of nature here. And he says these aren't just simple rules. It's not like in science where you try and get a few simple equations which will explain everything. And you're trying to boil everything down to the simplest point. These are highly complex and they are under personal control. They are not just random, absolute ideas kind of related to inert matter. No, these are more like the laws of a state, where you've got a head of state, and the head of state is deciding what are the best laws for his people, and how that his or her people, and how that they could be modified and changed and personalized as need be. So it's going to be, in order to understand nature and the laws by which it works, and particularly the laws that interact or affect human existence, you need to expand beyond the laws that you're trying to define in physics, chemistry, biology, and so on. And again, Sadhaputta goes to the Bhagavad Gita. This material nature is working under my direction, O son of Kunti, and it is producing all moving and non-moving beings. By its rule, this manifestation is created and annihilated again and again. So Sadhaputta then says, it seems that there's a hierarchy of laws of nature, and he divides them into three basics. He says, there's the laws that govern gross matter. They're going to be pretty simple, they're going to be mechanical, and this is the area where physics, biology, and all the sciences can really look at and see things. Of course, science doesn't really discover laws of nature, it discovers modeling systems, which we call laws because they tend to be fairly consistent and reliable. But they're not actually the laws that govern how matter moves, they're laws that govern how we will predict the behavior that we see around us. So that's the lowest level. The next level are the laws governing complex human action and behavior. Sadhaputta refers to these as higher order laws and identifies them as the laws of karma, which mediate our behavior and in certain ways. And we'll come to that in a moment. And these laws tend to be kind of legalistic and impersonal. They, if you are acting in a particular way, you're causing certain reactions with others, you're impacting other living entities' happiness and distress. So you should be rewarded or in some way disadvantaged thanks to your own behavior. So it's a kind of impersonal legalistic system. But then Sadhaputta, and this is a very big jump for the book, is bringing in the highest level, direct interventions of the Supreme Person. And he's saying that right at the top of this, the only way it all makes sense is if superconsciousness actually has complete unconstrained will. Now, this is a tough one for many conditioned souls. The idea that at the heart of all reality, the source of all reality, the absolute state of reality is actually the Supreme Person, and that everything happening at every level below that is actually subject to the unconstrained will of the Supreme. And this phrase, unconstrained will, I think is a theological term that other theologians have wrestled with, because the idea is that God should be able to do anything he likes and can do anything he likes. And that's frightening. That's to many people, to trust that there could be a conscious entity with that much power and ability. It just seems very frightening to many, because they don't trust. They know what they would be like if they were God or if they were in charge of things. Power goes to one's head and absolute power corrupts absolutely and all sorts of things like that. That's how people look at it. So they cannot trust that there could be a Supreme Person who would actually, whose unconstrained will would be personal and loving, caring, and would actually be for the benefit of every other conscious being. So Sadhaputta stresses, when we talk about unconstrained, we're not talking arbitrary here. It's not random, it's not inexplicable, it's not capricious. It's It's personal. It's a personal interaction. And this is now starting to hint at the bhakti relationship that exists between the individual soul, or has the potential for existing between the individual soul and the supreme soul. But first we talk about Paramatma. And again, Sadhguru quotes Gita. The Supreme Lord is situated in everyone's heart, O Arjuna, and is directing the wanderings of all living entities who are seated as on a machine made of the material energy. So the Paramatma in the heart, and I would refer readers also to the Srimad Bhagavatam. There's one purport particularly in the second canto, chapter 2, which is the Lord in the heart, and it's verse 35. A wonderful verse and a most amazing purport where Prabhupada analyzes this aspect of Paramatma, and it seems to be so fitting with this particular chapter and the way that Sadhguru, I'm sure he studied that deeply. It's the purport in which Prabhupada says that intelligence is the form direction of the supersoul. So the idea is that the embodied Jivatma is in a passive state, but we have no ability to influence the body. Yet we're conscious of the body being there, and we're full of desires that we'd like to implement via our physical body. But the Paramatma is the one, the bird who's perceiving this, responding to those desires by appropriately controlling the bodily machinery. And we don't understand how this works. We just know that I want something, I do it, and therefore I think, yep, I am this body, I am control, I am doing all this stuff. So Sadhguru gives these kind of features of superconsciousness, the Paramatma. And he mentions the statement where in the Gita where the Paramatma appears divided. Well, is it we got one bird in one tree with one soul, and then there's other trees with other souls? Does that mean that it's a different Paramatma? No. The Paramatma is situated as one. Wherever he is, there's just one Paramatma, but he's present in different ways. These are statements from this chapter that Paramatma has unlimited consciousness and able to attend to innumerable situations, unfathomable in our understanding, is not remote from the material world, is all pervading in space and time. Yet, although it's all pervading in space and time, he's transcendental to space and time. Prabhupada makes the point in that purport 2235 that this Paramatma feature cannot be the absolute aspect of God, because what the Paramatma is busily doing is looking after us and our desires and facilitating all of that. And that's not what the absolute personality of Godhead is all about. Krishna is beyond even that. Paramatma is his feature to do that activity, but Krishna himself is off there in the world of pure consciousness, enjoying himself in kind of pure pastimes and various activities with his devotees. So when we look at inspiration, we have to explain why certain things happen to some people, but other people don't get the same result. Now, desire is a common factor. And sometimes people are working on a particular project, which could be mathematical or could be anything else in this world. And, you know, sometimes their inspiration comes after intense endeavor. But in the situations that we've looked at, the really special cases seem to come as an unexpected realization. And Sadhguru proposes that these sudden illuminations are responses by Paramatma to the desires of the jiva. But why do they happen to some people and not others? Well, it's because of the same reason that all sorts of things happen to some people and not others. And those variations of experience are the consequence of karma. Again, this is a tough aspect of people to appreciate, because most people don't want to take responsibility even for their actions, and don't want to be told that their circumstances may be dependent on those previous actions. And of course, people have a single life concept, and therefore can't understand why there should be discrepancies and differences in the way people are born, that they're born into and have to live before they've really done anything in this lifetime. So karma requires the vision of eternity, the vision of many, many lifetimes being spent with our desires and with our with the activities that we have built up in that time. So Paramatma considers both current desires and past activities when awarding how the facilitation. And that includes just ordinary activities and includes inspirational input. And Sariputta defines karma as the accumulated byproducts of past actions. And he describes it that the laws of karma are an absolute standard for universal justice and morality. And they are just as real, but infinitely more complex, because we're dealing with the vagaries of human behavior throughout existence in many lives. And so they're far more complex than so-called natural laws of physics. Then this gives us the picture, which restated, that the Jivatma, the individual conscious soul, is simply a helpless spectator of the drama, the elaborate drama of the actions and reactions that are going on around us, thanks and based on our past and present desires. And the Jivatma therefore fully identifies with the body and is completely unaware of the role played by Paramatma. However, these incidences of inspiration kind of give us a hint, and aspects of conscience also, I think, give a similar indication that there is some direction coming to us that is beyond our mind, beyond our ordinary intelligence, where our intelligence is being fed insights, guidance, knowledge, illumination from something that is beyond anything we have come across or know for ourselves. It is that we are becoming illuminated knowledge directly from the Supreme. And so from Paramatma, it is possible to become directly aware of the Supreme Person and freed from karmic reactions. This is the one aspect of the unconstrained will, that although we are tied up with our karmic activities and therefore bound to repeat certain patterns, certain habits, and go through all sorts of situations, and being conditioned, bound, constrained in that way, Krishna's unconstrained will can free us from that sort of situation. So inspiration plays this kind of essential role in this state of consciousness. And this is the sort of inspiration that really interests Sariputta, what is mentioned in the Bhagavad Gita. To those who are constantly devoted and worship me with love, I give the understanding by which they can come to me. Out of compassion for them, I, dwelling in their hearts, destroy with the shining lamp of knowledge the darkness born of ignorance. So in this way, Krishna, the supreme absolute source that Sariputta is trying to guide us as being the revelation of Vedic knowledge, if the Jivatma approaches Krishna with love and without underlying motives, Krishna will reveal himself. So all inspiration based on our desire. We have material desires for material achievement. Krishna gives us intelligence to achieve that. Quite happily, we can do that, and we'll get the result according to karma. But if our desire is something greater, if it's to know the Paramatma, to understand our relationship with Paramatma, to understand our relationship with Krishna, and to approach Krishna, as it said here, with love and without underlying motives. Now, the motives that we approach Krishna are to maybe spiritualized motives, but at least they're not trying to perpetuate. They've got to be motives that aren't trying to perpetuate our illusions and attachments in the material world. Then Krishna can reveal himself, and he does so bit by bit according to how we are devoting our heart to him. So Sariputta makes this statement. This is the conclusion of Bhagavad Gita. And if you want to understand if this conclusion of Bhagavad Gita is true, then the only means of verifying the philosophy of Bhagavad Gita is actually to put this into practice, to approach Krishna with love and without underlying motives. And the whole purport of Bhagavad Gita will be revealed. So it is asking for the faith in the conclusion. But I suppose this is a bit like those mathematicians who saw Gauss's, Poincaré's, Riemann's theorems and decided, let's work on them. Maybe they're right. Let's work on, see if, and they had to go through the workings themselves and find, yeah, actually, it does work. So Sariputta is not offering something that is different to how we gain achievement and knowledge and proof through any other process of this material world. This is how you do it. If your theory reveals this, put it into practice. We are always in contact with the super soul. We are capable, therefore, of direct personal exchange. If Krishna is listening to all my desires and manipulating my body, he's there as Paramatma. And therefore, we're in constant contact. So let's just open the conversation and have a direct personal exchange about things which are more meaningful than how do I pick up my glass of water and drink it. There's got to be something more meaningful in my relationship with Paramatma, and asking for a deepening understanding. So hence, transcendental consciousness is theoretically attainable. Theoretically, meaning that I have to put it into practice in order to get it, but it is available to us. So just to conclude now, and I apologize if I've taken a little longer than I should have. Here's the takeaways from this chapter on inspiration. First of all, that inspiration challenges mechanistic ideas that the brain is the source of consciousness and various mental states. No, there is more to the model than that. It validates the proposition of the non-physical conscious self. And it also introduces the super self, the super soul, the super spirit, universal consciousness, and introduces us to the connection that the self must have with the super soul in order to explain the whole picture. So the Gita's unified picture of nature includes the jiva, the conscious self, matter, the modes, karma, and Paramatma. That is the picture. That's the complete picture of nature. And what really is being described by Sariputta is you have to extend science. If your science only looks at matter, and you haven't got an explanation or how consciousness plays, you don't understand it. If you think that matter is working without the information of the modes and being specified, not by random processes, but by highly complex algorithms within the modes, you don't understand nature. And if you think that the modes are working capriciously and by random, no, they're not. They're also facilitating karma. And if you think that all this works without an agency that ties it all together, the Paramatma, you haven't got a picture of nature. So I think Sariputta is doing something quite brilliant here. He is giving a picture of reality, which is actually naturalistic. Often the word naturalism is taken as a synonym for physicalism or materialism, but it's not. And it shouldn't be. And maybe we need to reclaim naturalism. The natural philosophers were concerned with more than just matter. And nature isn't just about matter. If you go to the Natural History Museum, yes, there's geology. BT will have a wonderful time there. But there's also life. And the study of life, past and present, will be there. And life involves consciousness. At least for human beings, we understand that if consciousness is not being exhibited by a human body, it's dead. We can switch off the machines, we can burn, bury, we can do that's no longer life. Life and consciousness go together. So if you're going to study matter and the world and call it, you're saying you're studying nature, you've got to include consciousness and life. And you've got to understand how all this works. So what Sadhuputta has done in this chapter on inspiration is within that picture of knowing our own consciousness and the body and the world, he's brought in the Paramatma as part of nature and an essential ingredient in the picture, in the overall composition of what we call nature. And that's how it's working, through karma, through the modes. So this is, I think there's a great lead that Sadhuputta is giving us in this chapter for the work, particularly of the Bhaktivedanta Institute. And he has introduced the hierarchy of natural laws, explaining where science has its place, where psychology, where theology, where morality has its place in the higher order laws of karma, and how the transcendental understanding of Krishna as the Supreme Personality of Godhead has its place as well. And through all of this, he's really issuing a call to us to aspire for transcendental consciousness. And by doing that, he's laid the foundations for further chapters, which will then take the process of achieving transcendental consciousness and describing them as part of this non-mechanistic science, the non-mechanistic science of Bhakti Yoga. What a brilliant chapter Sadhuputta has provided us. Thank you very much. Hare Krishna.
Thank you very much, Akhandadhi. That was crystal clear explanation of this chapter. Thank you. Let's open it up to discussion. So you can raise hands or just unmute yourself or put something in the chat and then we can read it out loud. Yeah, BT, go ahead.
Okay. You've taken probably one of his most important chapters and made it very comprehensible. Thank you. Since Sadhuputta did his work, there's several books that have come out. One would be Blink by Gladwell. The other would be Fast Thinking, Slow Thinking by Kahneman, the Nobel laureate. And in these books, the contention is made that there's a logical part of our brain and a part of our brain that works by intuition. So one of the examples given in Blink is a museum paid millions of dollars for a piece of artwork, and they analyzed it and decided it was legitimate. And then an art expert came in, and in 30 seconds, he said it's a phony, and it was a phony, just after all the analysis. So he learned this. He had the inspiration to do it. So since Sadhuputta's work, these other works have come out. Have you looked at them, and how would that integrate with what Sadhuputta was proposing?
Yeah, I think there's been a huge amount of work on the role of subconscious mind and its ability to generate all sorts of incredible ideas and that we then become aware of. And the model that we have of the conscious entity with the interface of mind facilitating our connection with the body, or what the body is up to, and particularly what's been received by the senses and how the senses are going to respond. The mind is generating so much. And in fact, for the jiva, practically speaking, everything we are thinking, experiencing, all our thinking, willing, feeling is now being handed over to the mind to tell us, what am I thinking? What am I feeling? What am I wanting? And the mind has this great power. It is an amazing element. And I think its abilities go far beyond what even the credit given in various books on the subconscious. But it is an unconscious AI chat GPT thing that we have we're attached to. And we're basically experiencing the world according to what the mind GPT tells us is going on. But what Sadhguru has done in this chapter on inspiration is show that that's not good enough. Just the idea of the subconscious mind and saying that the brain can do it, that's not good enough, because there's obviously things that the mind is doing which are beyond the brain and probably beyond the individual mind to come up with. And therefore there must be a connection to a greater source of information. So he's using inspiration and analyzing it like that to demonstrate you've got to think bigger if you want to bring, account for what we really experience in this world.
Thank you.
Okay, go ahead, Ferdinando. Hello. Well,
Yes.
Yes, go ahead, please. Go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your presentation. Very clear about Sariputta's chapter. A little point which I mentioned regarding the previous chapters as well, but still, I think an important one would be the subtle body, because when we deal with science in general, we have to deal with the body, so to speak, with atoms, with physics, with chemistry, like that. And then we move forward to mention that we have a mind. Of course, we have a mind, but then there is a difference between our brain, for example, with 8 billion cells, which works like a biological machine, basically, and our mind, actually, which is, as you mentioned, now it's very much advanced. But my question would be, how can we? I mean, there are many ways we can discuss the importance of the subtle body. For example, when there is a near-death experience, when we leave our body, for example, the death, then we have in the Srimad Bhagavatam explained that the Atman and the subtle body leaves the body and move to the next body, so to speak. So there is a sense of explanations in our shastras as well, that there is a subtle body, but what is the subtle body then? I think in one verse, a couple of verses, there is an explanation that the subtle body is as the same size of the physical body, but subtle. That means it's not visible. But a ghost, for example, is sometimes described as a experience of the subtle body still there. Just a few points about what do you think about the importance to explain? You explained very well Atman, Paramatma, very clear. You explained very clearly the body. You mentioned Buddhi, Ahankara, and Manas, but there is no really understanding of how does the subtle body functions within the body in connection with the Atman. There's something there which is missing. Just a question.
Okay, well, it's a good question and quite an involved one. Let me just say this. The subtle body is very important. And in the Atma paradigm, we take a slightly different route than Sadhguru has taken in this chapter, in that we try to give a mechanism, an explanation, a consciousness-based explanation that consciousness has ability to link to the subtle body, particularly mana, buddhi, ahankara, and that the subtle body is also composed of the subtle senses and the tanmatras. And therefore, it connects then with the physicality through the pranas, through the nadis, and so on. So there is kind of hierarchies of transfer of the interest or will of the jiva through the mind to the physical body. And we can model it like that. But we do make the point, even in the Atma paradigm, that even though we kind of do that and people go, oh, that's very interesting, yes, that's very helpful, none of that works without the Paramatma. That's the secret. Because Prakriti is the energy of the Paramatma. Maya Jakshena Prakriti Suyate Sacharacharam. It's his energy. So only the Paramatma ultimately manipulates it for us. That's the point that Sadhguru is making here. Now, I'm sure there'll be other analysis that is given on the role of the subtle body in terms of its part of our conditioning and also part of the process of what happens to the soul when it leaves. Those are all very important aspects. And our team of our neuro group with its biologists are really looking at how the psychological aspects of the mind then translate into aspects of physicality, both in embryogenesis, how the embryo develops, because that is not a random process and it is not something that is defined by genetics itself. It needs extra help, and the subtle body will play a part in that as well. So it's really, really important to a broader picture which unites both the transcendental science with the ordinary sciences, particularly of biology.
Thank you so much.
Right. Nartaka, go ahead.
Yeah. I was listening to a conversation with Srila Prabhupada, and so he was stating how the scientists understand very clearly that animals have instinct and that human beings have intuition about things, but they don't know where they come from. They don't know what is the real definition of instinct, what is the real definition of intuition. I suppose intuition is akin to inspiration. So so Prabhupada said the only logical or scientific explanation for that is Supersoul, Lord Paramatma. So
definitely.
I love your presentation. Thank you very much, Prabhu.
Thank you, Nartaka. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Intuitive processes, I think even Poincaré referred to that as part of this process of gaining knowledge. And instinct in both humans and in animals is a fascinating subject, because it's one of those terms that scientists have used. Oh, this creature is able to do this by instinct. That's no explanation whatsoever. It's just using a vague term to cover what is actually deserves a lot more attention and analysis. Where does instinct come from? The same analysis can be done with, as it's done on inspiration. Does it have a biological component? Very hard to show that. Does it have a cultural knowledge transmission component? Again, in many examples of what animals do, and what they're able to do without parental guidance is just amazing. So it's another demonstration that there has to be a higher form of intelligence also available, not just for humans, but the Paramatma is for everyone, for all creatures. So it's a very good, useful analysis on that aspect. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. Okay, any other questions, comments? We're at time. I really like this presentation, especially the explaining of, because it's true, we do feel absolutely like the doers. But we're not, and just trying to make sense of it. I think this chapter really makes the clear point of how that can be, how we can experience doing something with the desires and then it actually manifesting, but we're still not the doers. So I really appreciated that. It reminded me of the Bhagavad Gita verse where he says, knowledge, what is it? Knowledge 15. Oh, you're muted, Akhandadhi.
Sorry, yes, 15.
Knowledge forgetfulness. See, I forgot. Knowledge forgetfulness.
Atachmritir Jnanam Apohanam Cha. For me comes knowledge, remembrance, and forgetfulness. And forgetfulness in that respect isn't me losing my keys. It's forgetting my relationship with the Paramatma, particularly.
Yeah.
But that verse covers all that the Paramatma does to help us in material life and, more importantly, in transcendental life.
Yeah, and this inspiration, it seems to be part of that. So I really appreciated that. Thank you very much. Unless there are any other comments or questions, we're at time. And we